I've worked this early in the morning from the UK with the sun coming at this angle. It's a little bit bright. Hello.
It looks like you're having a moment of epiphany.
I really wish I was.
Yeah, maybe we'll wait for a minute more and then we'll make a start. Hi, Ivan. Thanks for joining, and very nice to have you here. We hope that this webinar will be of further use. And yeah, thanks for joining. Well, I guess we have a decent number of people in the call now. So maybe we'll just make a start. So to begin with, a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining this webinar today. I am Aditya Lola, Senior Electricity Policy Analyst working with Ember's Asia Desk. And we are excited to bring to you this webinar today, where we'll be talking about EU's electricity transition in 2020, and then reflect as we think about the Asian context. Today we are joined by my colleague Dave Jones, who is handling Ember's global team, and Mui Yang, who is a senior electricity analyst with the Ember's Asia Desk as well. And in this webinar, Dave will spend about 20 minutes to present the findings from one of Ember's recent reports on European power sector in 2020. This was published in collaboration with Agora Energiewende in January of 2021. And this is a part of, so it's been an ongoing series of the report which we've been publishing along with Agora. It's a 5th annual report which tracks European electricity transition. And in this particular analysis, we found that renewables overtook fossil fuels to become EU's main electricity source for the first time in 2020. So we are hoping that this presentation which Dave is going to give is going to kind of spur new ideas. And then after that, Mui will spend about 15 minutes to provide some reflections for Asia. He's going to explore some contextual backdrops and challenges we face in Asian countries. And then we'll promptly move on to Q&A session. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to kind of drop in your questions in the Q&A tool, which you'll find in the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can also add your questions. You can also upvote your questions, if you want something answered first. So please, feel free to kind of add questions as and when you have any. We will try and get to as many as possible towards the end of the webinar. And yeah, if you haven't done so already, please share in the chat box your name, organization, country, and what you're hoping to gain from this webinar. We would really like to use this feedback and plan our future events better. And yeah, we're also recording this webinar, so it will be published in our YouTube channel once it is done. So whoever, if somebody's missed this, there will be a chance to kind of have a look at it again. So we really hope that you'll enjoy this session. And without further ado, I will hand over it to my colleague Dave to start his presentation. Thank you.
Hey, morning everyone. Thanks for joining. It's a bit of a small group this morning, which is great because it means we can have a bit of discussion about whatever kind of aspects people are most interested in. So please do drop in questions as we go along, and we'll try and shape it around kind of where we want to go with the flow a little bit. So let's take that opportunity to have a kind of a bit of a tighter group in all of this to really kind of pull out what you want to know from all of this. So what I'm going to start by doing is I'm going to start by presenting the findings of the European electricity report that we released in January. It was the 6th year in a row that we've done it. Done it with the German think tank Agora Energiewende. And what we've done is we've analysed historic electricity generation by country, by fuel, updated it for the latest data from 2020 to try and pull out some trends to be able to explain how far that Europe is through its electricity transition, where some of the leaders are, some of the laggards are, and some of the key learnings, I guess, for other countries within Europe and outside Europe as well. We also researching now or in the advanced stages of a report that will come out at the end of March, on the 29th of March, which is the Global Electricity Review, where we do a similar thing at a global level. And one of the interesting parts of all of that is try to compare different regions about how fast their electricity transition is happening. And it's clear within Europe that Europe's much more advanced stage so far of decarbonising its grid, from where it's had that legacy fossil fuels in the mix. So let me start off. This is the main finding slide from the report. The headline for the report was called "Renewables Overtake Fossils," and what happened in 2020 was, for the first time in the electricity mix, renewables generation overtook fossil fuel generation. That was quite some milestone. If you kind of scroll back just a few years, you see how big that gap was between the two of them. When we talk about renewables, we're talking about wind, solar, we're talking about the legacy hydro, and we're talking about bioenergy. With fossil fuels, we're talking about coal and then gas and oil generation. And the bit that's obviously missing from here as well is nuclear, and nuclear has played a fairly consistent role in Europe over the last few decades, of around about 20% in the electricity mix. So most of the changes, although Germany is on a route to phase out its nuclear, most of the changes that you see happening within the European electricity mix are related to renewables building up, and that replacing fossil generation. And really, when we talk about renewables increasing, we're talking about wind and solar increasing. So you can see that dotted green line down the bottom, which is a function of renewables. And you can see it basically having, we're now basically at a fifth of Europe's electricity last year from just wind and solar. And then as that's built up, it's been displacing fossil fuel. And specifically coal generation has fallen very quickly. So you see coal generation, it was around 12% of the mix last year, and that's fallen by half in the last 5 years. So there's a rapid fall in fossil, but especially from coal. When we released this, we kind of wrote it up as a bit of a kind of deep dive on Europe, but really with a bit of a kind of global audience in mind, really, to try to kind of get people excited about the idea of how far the European electricity transition has come so far, and hopefully take some inspiration from it. And really, I guess that's the kind of the main overwhelming messages I want to give today about how successful it's been so far. But more than happy to talk through many of the learnings, some good learnings, some bad learnings from all of this. And it's very interesting to hear some of them for what it might mean for within different countries within Asia. So I'll try and talk a little bit about that as I go through, to make it relevant for the kind of things that you're thinking about. So we're talking about the pickup in renewables. This is the same slide with the bars of the different renewables underneath. You'll hear a lot about Europe, about growing bioenergy. That was a trend that really happened at the start of the 2000s, and then through the early last decade. And about the last 5 years, bioenergy has been fairly unchanged within Europe in terms of the electricity mix. So there are a few coal power plants that have been converting across to biomass. In total, in aggregate, that volume is relatively small. We can talk about that more if we want. We have a dedicated analyst within Ember that is looking at the biomass risk within Europe regarding the move away from coal. Then if the The biggest form of renewables is hydro. That's legacy hydro. You see it bouncing up and down. That's not just on the general weather conditions. There's been very little change to hydro for decades within Europe. Most of the sites were exploited or used decades ago. So hydro generation is not trending upwards within Europe. And then on top of that, you have that build of wind and solar, and that's been driving that whole increase in wind and solar, and specifically wind. So you can see that massive chunk within wind. So to start with, most of that historically has been through onshore, and then in the last 3 years, the step up in offshore wind has become absolutely massive, very exciting for where that leaves the potential for renewables in Europe over the next decade. So this is just showing about how that pickup in wind and solar penetration and the electricity mixes has progressed by country. And you've got that one in grey for Europe. You see in total across the decade, wind and solar's started about 6% of Europe's electricity, and it's now 20% of Europe's electricity. And you can see underneath that the different countries that are working at different speeds. So for most people, it won't be surprised that Denmark is number one. Denmark has had a consistent policy of embracing wind and really building that up. And I guess if there's any kind of lesson as to Denmark's success in this, it's the kind of year on year, almost like a decadal approach to the transition. So a lot of countries are, you'll see go through spurts of turning the taps on, turning the taps off, and there haven't been many countries that have had that continual support for wind and solar, which is what you need to be able to bring the prices down and for it to successfully get a high level of penetration throughout the mix. Next up is Ireland, which is really interesting. Ireland's growing all the time, and it's actually connected to quite a small grid as well. So whereas Denmark is embedded within the main Western European grid, Ireland is operating a little bit by itself, and that's really interesting. Some of the lessons learning coming out of that, because 35% for wind and solar, if you imagine every single hour underneath that, there's huge amounts of hours where you're getting huge proportion of your electricity from wind underneath that. Most of that growth in Ireland is from wind rather than from solar. And then as you go through, you can see that a lot of countries were extending that out in the last 5 years, but some countries have kind of gone backwards. Within Europe, there was a kind of early, if you start at the bottom of the list, there's an early build out at the start of the decade across an awful lot of countries within Europe. And in many countries that kind of stalled, it hit a bit of a backlash where renewables was relatively expensive at the time. There weren't that level of confidence about integrating it into the grid or a desire to really push that up to larger levels in the long term. And that left a bit of a kind of legacy through the rest of the decade that resulted in very low levels of build. And that's changing now, but it was something that stuck for quite a few years after that first burst of wind and solar first came through. We talk about how big wind and solar is within Europe already. It's nothing against what it will be in a decade's time. So the growth plans are absolutely stratospheric. So in order to reach the 2030 targets that Europe has set itself and agreed, it probably requires around close to 100 terawatt hours a year. In the Commission modelling, the impact assessment, they assume that we'll be needing to build around about 100 terawatt hours a year of extra generation from wind and solar to be able to meet those targets. Last year it was 51 terawatt hour. Across the whole of last decade, it was 38 terawatt hours. So you're talking almost 3 times the level of growth that we saw last decade. That we'll be seeing next decade. When we go back and look at the, this is from the IEA, when you go back and look at how much actual capacity is being installed on the ground, you can see that rising. So for wind in 2020, it suffered a few delays as a result of COVID, but also that pipeline was really due to step up from 2021. So 2020 didn't set any records, but you can see from 2021 is likely to set a new record this year for wind installed, and then that that to grow even further in 2022. Still not increasing then faster than what needs to happen for those 2030 targets. So it'd be interesting to see how that progresses throughout the decade. But already within the pipeline, you can see that really setting new records this year. Solar, if you know the history of solar within Europe, there was a massive spike in 2011 and never got back to that level ever again yet. 2021, it's possible that we, for the first time, we do exceed that peak that was set back in 2011. And then it's likely to grow even further than that. The IEA numbers are really conservative on this. For wind, you get a fairly good, especially for offshore, you get a fairly good idea of the pipeline for the next 3 or 4 years, because you need the feed-in tariffs for it, and the auctions for it, and especially for offshore, you've got you've got deployment times of about three years or so. For solar, you can go out and put the panel on your roof tomorrow. So these numbers are a lot more uncertain about how much these arise, and I'd be surprised if the actual numbers on the ground don't exceed this base case. Exceed the accelerated case. With the price reductions that happen in solar and the embrace in many countries within Europe of solar, there's a potential to really step that up aggressively. In terms of the COVID impact, we did a lot of work looking at electricity demand of COVID, and throughout April, when lockdown first happened in Europe, there was massive reductions in electricity demand in Europe as a whole. It's 12%. France and Italy saw much bigger, so close to 20% electricity demand, but that kind of all caught up through the rest of the year, and by the end of the year we were actually seeing as much electricity used as there was pre-COVID, and that's the case for most countries. So although that was deep at the time, when industry was on proper lockdown and people were isolated at home, I guess, that has really got back to where we started, and it'll be and after I've done my bit, we will talk a bit about the electricity demand in different countries, and that's such a key driver for fossil generation in particular. So that was the kind of catch up on renewable side. On the fossil side, this is what it looks like. This is the terawatt hours in Europe, and basically we've seen a halving of it in the last 5 years, which is amazing progress on coal. And even in the last 2 years, you see a big bite into that lignite generation. So historically, hard coal, which is traded on the international markets, are relatively expensive, has been falling anyway. And now you'll start eating into that lignite generation for a variety of reasons, in part because of closure of lignite plants, and in part just because the economics are undercutting it from other fuels, as gas became cheaper in part through 2020 than lignite. Obviously within Europe we've got a carbon price which adds significantly onto the coal price. And then also just that build out of wind and solar means that you need coal generation for fewer hours throughout the year. When you look at it as percentage of the mix, you can see this is wind and solar and coal, and you can see that as that wind and solar mix has gone up, it is really eating into coal generation in certain countries. You can see in Germany, it's really starting to eat up. In Netherlands, for example, it's starting to eat up to really collapse this level of coal generation all the way down. And these are kind of useful graphics just to explain how far that's happened. And this isn't just happening within Europe. In the report that will come out at the end of March, you'll be able to see this is happening throughout the whole world. As that wind and solar is building up, it's taking market share from coal. Within Europe, however, if you add gas onto there as well, we've got an awful long way to go. So it's great, for example, let's go back to Netherlands, for example, that as that wind and solar builds up, it's eating into that coal. But actually, there's a huge amount of gas left in the electricity mix to carry on through until you start decarbonising that grid. And I pulled out Netherlands for a reason, and that's because after Poland, it may not surprise you that Poland is top of the list for the amount of fossil fuel in the mix, but then you've got Netherlands, then you've got Greece Island. These are all countries which have been phasing out coal, but have still got so much gas left in the mix that even though they're kind of having got that stage with coal, they got a long way until they've decarbonised their grid. One thing that Muri talks through in a little bit is about the gas risk in different countries, and I can explain more if you want to know more about some of the lessons from within Europe. But within Europe, this is a change in the last 5 years. The coal has fallen a lot faster than wind and solar has risen, and that's because gas generation has also picked up as well. Within Europe, a lot of that increase in gas is, and there's no actual capex or extra money being spent with that at all. It's existing infrastructure that's just running harder rather than new investment. So it's not an investment issue, it's more just an economics issue that the gas is taking over the coal. So it's, on one hand, it's quite good that the coal's falling so quickly. On the other hand, you kind of switching from one fossil fuel into another fossil fuel. So it's not going any further to getting your reliance off fossil fuel. Of course, what it is doing is it's helping reduce the carbon intensity of the grid. So, like, ultimately, this is the metric that we're most interested in, which is the carbon intensity of each of the grids across Europe. And you can see that within the last 5 years, there's been that big fall of 29% in Europe's carbon intensity, which has been really exciting to see. And the reason why that's fallen less than what coal's fallen by is obviously because there's a pickup in gas as well throughout that. So by definition, that fall in fall in the carbon intensity is less than the fall in coal. But really quite impressive, and so far, but still a long way to go before that grid is 100% clean. And then I guess a couple of slides just to end on to give a bit more context. And I've gone through all this a little bit quickly, so have questions to go through bits that can interest you a bit more. So please start thinking about where we can go with discussion. And there's two things I want to say within Europe. One part is about that progression of phase outs within the country. So the UK was the first country to announce a coal phase out back in 2015, 5.5 years ago, just before Paris COP. And then other countries have followed suit. So these dark green colours are colours that have already phased out coal. The light green colours are ones that are committed to phase out coal in the next few years. You've got Germany, which has promised to phase out coal, but by 2038, hopefully that will be that will prove to be much earlier than that. And then there's other countries like Spain that have really collapsed coal generation, but haven't announced an explicit phase out. And then you've got countries in red who are slowly reducing the amount of coal generation, but I don't have a specific plan or a specific announcement for how they'll get rid of coal. And it's really interesting that like every day that goes on, there's a bit more movement on here. And the latest bit of movement was on Hungary to bring forward its phase out. Previously, it was anticipating to shut by 2030. Now it's committed to phase out coal by 2025, where lignite had played a bit of a role in the electricity mix before that. So that's interesting to think about slightly. And then the other part that Europe Beyond Coal, I don't know if you're aware of them, are also tracking is the amount of plants that have closed or announced to close. And so far, almost half of Europe's coal plants have either retired or announced to retire. And in the coming few weeks, we're going to hit that halfway point, so that'll be a bit of a celebration in Europe's progression away from coal, is when we get to that point of half the coal plants in Europe committed to have closed. And final, just to end on before I hand over to Muri, I just wanted to go through these charts, and the reason is that hopefully it gives a bit more context for then what Muri will move on to talk about. So this is the IEA forecast of wind and solar in the next from 2019 to 2025. So over the next half decade, with the change wind and solar, change in all the other forms of generation within the EU and the US. Even with the uptake of electrification of electric cars and so on, the increase in electricity demand is relatively small. So that when you're building that new wind and solar that's coming online, generally it will be displacing fossil generation. Across Asia, you have a very, very different problem where you've still got rising electricity demand. So at the moment, the wind and solar that's coming online, that's according to the IEA, is not even coming close to meeting that increase in electricity demand. So rather than fossil demand falling or conventional generation falling, you're like on the current build rate, if the electricity demand increases right, then you've actually got more of a reliance on fossil generation rather than less of a reliance. So try to so to try to collapse coal in these countries is such a different challenge from what there is in Europe, in the UK, and the US. And then just to end on is about how quickly we need to collapse coal. So the IEA did their first modelling in the World Energy Outlook in October of what a net zero pathway looks like to 2030, and for coal. You can see that they forecast that coal generation has got to collapse. So on their previous environmental forecast, the Sustainable Development Scenario, they were saying that coal generation has got to roughly halve by 2030. Actually, for a net zero pathway, it's got to fall by about 3/4, which is about in line with a lot of the IO 1.5 degree IPC scenarios. And interestingly, when they did the graphic, they split it by technology. And on that, they're basically saying that in practice means that subcritical coal plants have got to almost have phased out or reduced their generation substantially, almost to zero by 2030. And what we did was we took some Global Energy Monitor coal capacity data in gigawatts to show where that subcritical capacity is. And every country has obviously a substantial degree of subcritical coal capacity. So there's two ways to think about this collapsing coal generation that's needed. Firstly, that we need to collapse it globally by 3/4 by 2030 for a net zero pathway, but really focusing obviously on the least efficient of that, which is a really almost complete phase out of subcritical by 2030. And one thing to end on is just to keep an eye on the next stage of this analysis from IEA. 18th of May, it will come out when they produce their full net zero scenario that will feed into a lot of the COP discussions for COP26 throughout 2021. And that will have a much better breakdown of coal by country with the proper pathways through. So do keep an eye out on the 18th of May from coming out for the IEA about what that means for the electricity transition in your country. So I hope that was useful. I just see one question. I'll come back to the questions at the end and hand over to Miri now. So I hope that's useful. And we still have loads of time for questions at the end. So Miri, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave. Morning, evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. And I'm going to firstly share my screen. So I'm going to discuss some reflections for Asia arising from the European experience presented in the European report, as well as discussed by Dave just in a couple minutes ago. And my presentation will flow as follows. Firstly, I will discuss coal generation in Asia as a contextual backdrop for understanding of various arguments put forward in the presentation. And then I will discuss 3 key factors that arising from the EU experience and also discussed by Dave that are likely to have major important influence in shaping the electricity transition process in Asia. And then after that, some final remarks. So Dave has already showed this figure. This is this figure is taken from the most recent World Energy Outlook report published by the International Energy Agency. It shows that coal generation needs to reduce by 70 to 80% in the next 10 years in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degree. And this figure shows the coal generation by country. And it's very clear that Asia countries, especially China, India, Indonesia, and a few other Asia countries, has been the major drivers of coal generation in the world. And in 2020, they together account for over 80% of the coal-fired electricity generated in the world. So in order to put the world on a 1.5 degree pathway, Asia's coal generation really needs to reduce dramatically in the next 10 years. But it doesn't seem like that we are moving towards that pathway, but everything is possible. This requires us to start phasing out the use of coal in the next 10 years by stopping adding new coal capacity and also retiring existing capacity. And there are three main factors that are important, that may be worth considering in this process. The first factor is the growth of electricity demand. What makes Asia special is that major Asia countries are having fast growing demand for electricity. And this figure shows the average annual growth rate of electricity demand between 2015 and 2019. And it's very clear that Indonesia, China, India, the three largest economy in this developing economy in this region, are having very fast rate of electricity demand growth. And they are much higher than the world average and higher than many well-developed countries. And because of this fast-growing demand, and take China as an example. Between 2015 and 2020, electricity demand in China increased by roughly 1,900 terawatt-hour. And wind and solar generation also increased significantly by over 500 terawatt-hour. This is roughly comparable to the total electricity generation in Korea in 2020. But it's because the demand growth, the electricity demand is so big, is even more than the total electricity generation in India in 2020. When solar generation increased, wind and solar generation is insufficient to meet even the increased demand, let alone the existing demand. Because of that, all other generations has also expanded in order to make to maintain the overall sufficiency of electricity supply. And this generation include coal generation. And a similar situation has also been observed in other major Asia developing economies, including Indonesia and India. And this figure shows the electricity demand per capita from G20 economies. And we can see that India and Indonesia are having very low electricity demand per capita when compared with other G20 countries. And their electricity demand per capita are even much less than the world average. For China, the electricity demand per capita is higher than the world average, but still much less than more developed economies. This implies that huge potential for future demand growth. And the future electricity demand growth may become one of the biggest uncertainty for coal phasing out and electricity transition in Asia, because that means that we need to build more capacity to meet more renewable capacity to meet rising electricity demand, and also to replace coal and other fossil fuels to meet existing demand. And that's a massive challenge. So apart from this factor, another factor I'm going to discuss is the role of gas in Asia's future electricity landscape. And this figure shows the role of gas in Asia's generation mix in 2019. And we can see that in some of the Asia countries, the share of gas generation is quite high. is more than 60%. That's in Thailand. And in Japan and Malaysia, South Korea, they also have a large share of gas in their generation mix. And for others like China, India, because they have historically relied on coal for electric generation, they don't have much gas in their generation mix. So this does not seem to have any consensus on the role of gas in Asia's generation mix now. And but it's probably time for them to start thinking about how what role gas will play in their future generation mix. And there are a few issues that may be worth considering when they defining the role of gas in their electricity generation mix in the future. One factor is the strong synergy between renewables and gas, because gas can help promote the uptake of renewable by providing fast responsive capacity to the electricity market, especially during peak demand period. But gas generation may also create something called crowd out effect. This in fact happen when investment is redirected away from renewables into gas. That means that we are over-invest into gas infrastructure and generation. And as a result of that, this may create some effect called carbon lock-in, because gas generation is also a fossil fuel type of fossil fuel generation, and it needs to be phased out one day in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. But if we have excessive gas investment, that means that this will make gas phase out difficult, and leading to a technology lock-in, and as a result, and consequently a carbon lock-in in the future. And the last factor that may be worth considering is the emissions impact. The coal generation may be less emissions intensive when compared with coal generation, but its production and transportation may lead to methane leakage. And methane is a type of greenhouse gas. It has much more significant warming effect when compared with other greenhouse gases. So this factor may also need to be considered when estimating the emission intensity of various generating technology, including gas. And the last factor I'm going to discuss is the integration of electricity market. So the European experience has suggests that the better integration of electricity market has made significant contribution to low carbon electricity transition. And this contribution has primarily arisen from a few factors as follow. One of these factors is temporal and spatial complementarity of renewable generation. And the figure below show a typical day in Portugal. I've taken this figure from a ARENA report. It shows that when generation decreased during daytime period, while solar generation increased during this time period. So because of that, wind and solar somehow complement each other in meeting electricity demand. And because wind and solar resources are normally located in different areas, so they also have some special complementarity arising from that. So because of this complementarity, if we can exploit this complementarity, this can enable better utilization of renewable capacity. I will take Denmark as an example, because Denmark is having #1 wind and solar uptake in Europe. And why Denmark can achieve that? One of the key factors is significant interconnections between Denmark and its neighboring countries, because this avoid wind and solar curtailment, because excessive wind and solar power is typically sold to neighboring countries for charging, for example, solar pump storage facilities. This example is taken from a report produced by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. And then better market integration of electricity market can also improve the economic viability of large renewable projects. And this factor is more relevant for Asia countries, especially those small Asia countries, because given their small domestic market, large renewable project may not be justified on the economic ground. But if they can have a better interconnection with neighboring countries, they can sell excessive capacity to their neighboring countries, then large renewable projects become economically viable. And better integration of electricity market can also help reduce the need for excessive reserve capacity. And this is especially important for a system with large output from variable renewables, because we need large amount of reserve capacity to deal with the intermittency of renewables. But if we have a better connection with a neighboring market, that means that we can source reserve capacity from our neighbors rather than having lots of capacity domestically. This can help lower electricity price, making the transition process more smoothly. And then some final remarks. So based on the about discussion, we can see that electricity transition towards a low carbon electricity future require not only the phase out of fossil fuels, but also a reconfiguration of the energy and economic system in order to accommodate large change in the generation mix. Say, for example, we need to probably restructure the economic development model to make electricity demand growth more sustainable in order to make the phase out of fossil fuel easier. And we also probably also need to improve the interconnection of electricity market in order to exploit the complementary of renewables and other generating technologies. And because of that, we probably need a broader focus of electricity transition, not only confining to the generation mix. So that means that we should have a target not only on changing in the generation technology mix, but also other aspects of the energy system and the wider economic system. And when we are campaigning towards those, on those targets, we should always ask for more ambitious, but not only sufficient target, because in the context of Asia, policy implementation is always an issue. There are always some delays in implementation. Say, for example, electricity market reform has been initiated in most Southeast Asia countries since early 1990s, but even now, only 2 countries have established functioning wholesale market for electricity. Now, and most other countries have continued to solve their electricity through single buyer model with a monopoly electric utility in the market. And now the last point is beware of the gas risk. Say once we start phasing out the use of coal for electric generation, we probably need to also beware of that we don't step into another fossil fuel risk, that is gas risk. And thank you. And now I think it's time for questions and answers. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Mui, and thanks, Dave, for setting the stage up, and thanks, Mui, for going into a little bit of details, even though it was broader Asian context. Thank you for going into the details. And before we move on to the question, we have a couple of questions here. I just want to take 1 or 2 minutes just to kind of update you on what Ember has been doing with respect to its analysis work in Asia. So we have our flagship Global Electricity Review report, which is coming out end of this month, which is it is slated to be released on 29th of March. And for the first time, we are doing country deep dives in this report, and we are looking at G20 countries in particular. So that means that we'll be having deep dives for 5 Asian countries, namely China, India, South Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. Our analysis has showed some really interesting findings, and we are really excited to have that feature out at the end of this one. So please keep watching this space. And that's the first update. And the second update is that we've one of the challenges which we find in Asia is that we don't really have a single place where we can find up-to-date data from different countries. So what we have done recently, so we've tried to collate all that data sources from different countries, and we've put together something called Asian Transparency Report. I'm sharing the link in the chat box. Please feel free to kind of have a look, and we encourage you to use that data. And we also would be we would welcome any kind of inputs on it. We are constantly trying to improve that database, and we want to make it a live one-stop data collection place for Asian countries. So if any of the countries data is missing, we would invite you to please reach out to us, and we will make sure that even that data is up to date. So yeah, so without further ado, I think let me just get going with the questions. We have three different questions. So maybe I'll start in the order we've received the questions. So the first question is from Lee Suk-hyun, and it's a question on coal phase out in Europe. The question goes, is there any case where construction of a new coal power plant had started, but then stopped before its completion, and thus never gone online? And was there any compensation given out? Dave, would you like to take that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't think of any specific example within Europe. One thing specifically to say around that is not to be shut down at the construction phase, but there's been a lot of focus in different countries around what happens with new build coal power plants. So within Netherlands, for example, there were 3 big brand new coal power plants that came online in 2015. And then in 2018, the Netherlands announced their coal phase out commitment to phase out coal by 2030, which means that these would be close to 15 years old. And I think most of the discussion within Europe prior to that was, you'd expect to run a coal plant for 30 years, maybe 40 years, even longer. So this whole mandating for coal power plant to shut while it was still a teenager was quite a big thing. There is still a legal case going on with the utilities where they want to sue the Netherlands government for it. And from civil society's perspective, we got involved in it alongside Client Earth, a lot of others around that case within Netherlands around to what extent around that compensation case, because if you start giving compensation, you kind of go down a bit of a slippery slope if you commit to give compensation to people with polluting assets for all sorts of reasons. So the problem that we have is that firstly it creates the perverse incentives to stay open for longer. Or to carry on building that coal power plant if it looks like you might get paid to shut it or to never operate it. So firstly, it gives perverse incentives if you go down that route of compensation. So that's something that we're really worried about. And secondly, if coal's meant to be the easy one out of coal, oil and gas, about kind of the whole progression of the as the world comes off fossil fuels. So if you end up paying a coal power plant to come offline, who else do you then need to then compensate further down the line, where surely the emphasis should be on the polluter pays rather than the polluter is compensated mechanism. So in answer to your question, no, I can't think of an exact question, but there's definitely that principle with new assets.
The next question is from Ben Coxon. He asked, what role does energy efficiency, particularly grid efficiency, play in reducing carbon intensity of Asia's electricity generation?
I think I would take this question.
Yes, ma'am.
I think there's no direct answer to this question because the lack of technical efficiency at the supply side is a major issue for some countries, especially some island countries like Indonesia and Philippines, but not in others like China, because China has one of the coal generation is most efficient in China when compared with other major economies. So there's not too much efficient improvement that can be achieved there. But now here, in order to make the electricity demand growth more sustainable in Asia, in my view, it's not only about improving the technical efficiency at the supply side. We also need to improve the electricity efficiency at the consumption side, and to encourage more efficient consumption of electricity, and also to promote economic restructuring towards less electricity intensive sectors like service sector and high technology sector. Apart from that, probably we also need to promote electricity pricing reform, because in many Asian countries, their electricity prices are still highly regulated and the prices are not cost reflective. So we probably also need to further promote electricity pricing reform to make price more cost reflective, so that it can encourage more rational consumption behavior of electricity.
Yeah, I think it's two further things that I'd like to add to that. It's a great question around the efficiency side, and one is just about how much of the pickup in demand across Asia in electricity demand is from air conditioning, and energy efficiency standards within air conditioning is kind of what, like, if you were to choose like one critical efficiency measure, that's definitely one of them. The other one to mention, and you talk about grid efficiency, is obviously the difference between the coal power plants within Asia. There's that big kind of discussion around efficient coal versus inefficient coal, and that's quite a nice, useful wedge, really, when you're talking about the efficiency of the coal. That when you're talking about how do you start reducing coal generation, make sure that's focused on the lower efficiency plants as much as possible, so you get that extra efficiency boost, and also it's those low efficiency coal plants, the older coal plants, that are providing the so much of a higher proportion of the air pollution impact that comes from, in terms of SOx, NOx and dust, that comes from that, where the more efficient plants were built with better filtration on them. So there's a huge benefit to focusing on the phase out of those low efficient coal power plants.
Thanks for that. The next question is from Ivan Gach from Kiko Network. He says, to meet its 2050 net zero target, instead of phasing out coal, Japan is largely relying on innovative technology that is not yet available or economically viable, such as carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and more efficient coal technology. Is there a risk of similar narratives slowing down or derailing the shift to renewables in other countries? If not, how was this avoided? Dave, I know that this is something which
it's hilarious, the conversation in Japan, because there's no other country that within Europe you see a lot on that whole build up of cool tech, of like the tech will solve this problem, but nowhere you see that as much as you do in Japan. The whole idea about shipping ammonia across to put into coal power plants, or hydrogen made from lignite and shipping that across is pretty crazy ideas. I think that within Europe there's a huge within Europe there's like that hydrogen the hydrogen hype that exists in most countries across the world now, and the natural kind of pushback within hydrogen is to get some real like energy experts really making sure to push back against the efficiency of it, the efficiency arguments of it. So like hydrogen can't be portrayed as evil, but it's you don't want to portray it as evil. It could be really useful in many ways for all sorts of reasons, but how do you put that in context more? So the answer within the UK, for example, the answer is really push back hard about using it to about saying how you can't use hydrogen in the decarbonisation of heating. So in the UK, we have a big problem of how do you decarbonise heat? And of course, the natural answer is, oh, the magic hydrogen. It's like, well, hydrogen does have a role in some industries in some ways. And it's really trying to pull out those energy experts to say which places it's useful for and how inefficient it is in the places it is not suitable for. And I do think that's within Europe proved the best way to combat some of that hype. And it's a real risk. It is a real risk everywhere. So it's a great question. I don't know if that answers the question, or if you have a follow-up question. If you do, just throw it into the box.
Yeah, we have a few minutes more, so if anybody has any more questions, please do feel free to add in the chat. And
Louis, is there anything else that you wanted to add on that at all? Because we do see that popping up everywhere.
No, not really.
I think one of the interesting bits around that is there's part of the like so much of the discussion is focused on the kind of the sexy investment jobs part, the green part, how like what those answers are, and then is making sure that the brown part is dealt with. So in the case of I saw someone from China Dialogue that was joining in, they're on here, but the write-up for China Dialogue about China's 5-year plan and saying it's great that the green bit's been addressed, but what about the brown bit? Like where is that route away from coal? So at the moment we've still got the peak coal target for 2030, still haven't got a kind of plan through the 5-year plan about how to reduce explicitly reduce coal generation, and I'm sure that will come in some ways, but at the moment there's so much of that 5-year plan and so much of policy generally across Asia and across the world is focused on that build up of green rather than the phase out of the old stuff. How do you do that? And that's certainly where Europe started. Within Europe, it was all about Germany's Energiewende building lots of wind and solar, and then realizing that coal wasn't phasing out as fast as that they might have hoped with all of this, because they never had an explicit plan for coal. And Europe's now kind of managed to start dealing with that by looking at coal phase out. How do you actually put a coal phase out plan in? How do you make sure that you don't have those assets there still generating, that are creating CO2 within the mix? You need to have a whole plan to move away from them, as well as a plan to move towards all of that new green stuff, whether it's just wind and solar or nuclear and all the other hydrogen bits in the mix.
Thanks for that, Dave.
On hydrogen, one of the biggest things within Europe is about that pickup in electrolyzer demand. So how do you get that extra? How do you meet that extra electricity demand? So it actually, on the hydrogen side, it actually raises more questions over. In some cases, it raises those questions over. How do you decarbonize the electricity system when you've got that electricity demand in? So try and tie that in, and I hope that's being thought about elsewhere as well.
Well, I think we have now hit the hours mark. In case nobody has any more questions, feel free to kind of reach out to any of us by email if you have any questions, and we would be happy to hear from you. If this conversation inspired any new ideas, we would be happy to kind of have a chat, collaborate, and work on any new projects as well. And Ember is always ready to kind of support organizations within Asia. So please feel free to use the resources that we have in our website, which is www.ember-climate.org. And I look forward to hearing from you, and I'm sure in the future we will be talking one-on-one as well. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully see you soon. Have a nice day.